what I'm talking about here is work I did when I was working at Osmosoft, which I've moved on from recently. A little bit of a discovery process about all the hacks that go on behind the scenes of an application like TiddlyWiki, which is a single-page application. And in many respects, TiddlyWiki is a very understood software framework. It's more than just an application. So, quick demo of what TiddlyWiki is. How many people here have heard of TiddlyWiki? All right, probably about a third. How many people actually have used TiddlyWiki? Cool, nice to see people using it as well. The way it works is I can download this. So this is sitting on an HTTP URL, standard web server. I download it to my local system, and now it's actually running on the file system. So you can see it's just a file URL, hence we call it a single page application running off a file URL. And I can actually start changing this thing. So I can say, save it, and it's going to see check if I'm allowing it to do that, because I've just saved to local file system. So I can actually reload this now, and just to prove the point, it's reloaded. And this is running on the file system, saving to the file system without any browser extensions being installed. And what's quite cool about TiddlyWiki as an application is it lets you do more than just manipulate these little bits of content, these tiddlers that are basically like little blocks of content that show up with a title and a text, and everything's composed of these things. You can actually go beyond just treating it as something for content, although that in itself is quite useful for many people. That's all they ever do, and that's fine. But you can actually go on and you can start customizing it. So I can start doing things like change the site title, and I can get even more advanced if I know how to do that, because a lot of the people in the TiddlyWiki community are not programmers. They're people like poets and genealogists and physicists, people who just want to make little tweaks. So these are the kind of people who are quite comfortable doing things like this and taking it as far as they want to take it. And I can even get further than that. If I really know what I'm doing, I can actually do some programming as well. And this is everything's tiddlers here, so it's a very simple model of modularity where you don't have to learn new concepts for every type of thing you're doing. So all I'm doing is I'm tagging this tiddler as a system config tiddler, and that means that the system knows that it gets evaluated on startup. So when I do a save and reload the page, you've got JavaScript being executed. So you can take it as far as you want, and with that JavaScript you can start manipulating all of the underlying components here and start building entire applications on top of what looks like just a simple personal wiki. And in fact, the presentation I'm using here is dog fooding. It's another version of TiddlyWiki that's got all these plugins that have been reused from other places and some extra configuration that's been done on top of it. So what I think is cool about this sort of model is it's the idea of extreme agility, because there was a talk a little while ago, or a paper a little while ago, talking about extreme agility as being something where programmers are writing the kinds of things they want themselves, but we don't all have that luxury. So to me, what extreme agility is about, it's about empowering users to tweak their own environment. And I think the spreadsheet is a perfect example of this, much loathed by IT departments for this very reason, but something that gives users great power to set their own environments up. And it's agility from a deployment point of view as well as a development point of view. From a deployment point of view, you're just dealing with a single file with all of your HTML, JavaScript, CSS, and the content inside that file. So that lets you run it on your own system. It lets you mail it to your friends, lets you upload it to a web server just using a static FTTP upload and having a static file sitting on the server. And it also lets you put it on a shared drive and treat it as a very lightweight sort of multi-user system where other people can access that too and change the content. So that's from a deployment point of view. From a development point of view, like I've just shown you, it also is very easy for individual users who aren't programmers to tweak. And to me, that's real agility. It's a single-page application. Most of us have probably done this kind of thing where we want to experiment with a bit of CSS or JavaScript, so we'll open up our text editor, save to the file, and open that in the browser against a file URI. But TiddlyWiki goes further than that because it also allows saving. So the first version actually just had a little text area because Jeremy Ruston, the creator and my former boss at Osmosoft, he figured, well, you can't really save to the local file system, right? That's crazy. No web application could let you do that. So it was just a text area that said, you know, now that you've changed all this, you're going to have to cut and paste this back into the original file. And what's very cool about this, nice open source success story here, someone actually came along and wrote a Firefox extension and to actually do saving, and Jeremy looked at this and he looked at the code and he said, no, that's kind of interesting. I wonder what would happen if I put this in the actual TiddlyWiki application. And this is back in 2004, and it actually, lo and behold, did actually work. It actually allowed saving without having any browser extensions installed, just with that simple pop-up dialog you saw a moment ago to check if you're okay with it. And so ever since then, it's turned out that you can actually do saving with TiddlyWiki. So it leads you from these different sets of evolution. You've got the single page application, which is the kind of thing we all know, where it's just a single bit of rich interactive JavaScript that runs either from a server or from just a file URI. Then you go to the next stage, which is once you can start saving and doing that round trip back and forth, you've got what I call a single page application and database. And then the step beyond that, the next insight was, well, we've got all of our JavaScript and our CSS sitting in this file anyway. We may as well let the users actually edit that while they're actually working with the application to do all those kinds of tweaks that users, even if they're not programmers, are quite capable of doing. And especially because there's also a plugin mechanism that lets you pull plugins from other places on the net very easily too. Users are quite comfortable with configuring stuff like that. So it does position TiddlyWiki as a kind of cloud IDE in the same vein as things like Bespin, JSPin, and JSFiddle, where we're seeing a lot more of this actually editing JavaScript inside the actual browser. Not that you have to do it this way. Most of us who've written fairly complex applications on top of TiddlyWiki still use an editor and a make type tool, but for doing those little tweaks, very handy. And if you want to get a feel for some of the things that are written on top of TiddlyWiki, application frameworks, I created a showcase just before I left Osmosoft actually that goes through a bunch of verticals. All these slides are online too. If you look on the JSConf tag, I just put on Twitter the actual the link for these presentations. And just to mention too, although there are some very cool things about running off the file URI, there are also some great advantages to running things in the cloud. And there is a whole server-side story to TiddlyWiki as well. So where it gets positioned from this point of view is you've got all these tiddlers that I just showed you, those just little blocks of text content. All of those things can sit as resources on a RESTful web server as well, and that's what TiddlyWeb and TiddlySpace enable, so that you can put to them and get them and delete them, and you can render them as JSON or HTML or however you want. And then what you can do is you can compose them together too, so you can have a whole bunch of tiddlers and render those things as JSON or whatever. But what you can also do is you can take a whole bunch of tiddlers sitting on the server and render them on the browser as a wiki, in which case you get the TiddlyWiki, and TiddlyWiki then becomes a single page application client into a NoSQL RESTful database. So it leads to a very interesting model, which I've demonstrated in this screencast here, right at the end, where I've developed the whole thing on the file URI, but then at the last stage, I actually go and upload to a server. And at that point, you can start setting up your security policies, and you can say what kind of tiddlers can be accessed by what kind of users in what kinds of ways. But your day-to-day development is done on a file URI. So this is talk more than just about TiddlyWiki. It's about some of the hacks that we uncovered in the creation and the ongoing evolution of TiddlyWiki. And the most obvious hack here is the file access. It's the fact that in all of these different browsers, you can actually talk to the file system, which is something that a lot of people just aren't aware of. TiddlyWiki these days is built on top of jQuery, so there's been a file plugin extracted from jQuery, TW file. And interestingly enough, it doesn't just save back to itself the TiddlyWiki that you're actually running. It actually will do general purpose file manipulation, loading and saving any file on your hard drive. it's got a bunch of strategy objects, different implementations depending on what the current environment is. So it will sort of say, can you do this? No. Okay, can you do this? No. And it'll go through until it finds something that will actually be able to deal with it. The first one that was created, and the one that most people use today because it's the best supported, is on Firefox. So it's this Mozilla object. And you can see here that it's got this, in Mozilla, these native objects, component.interfaces.nsi local file, component.interfaces.nsi file output stream. And once you know that those things exist, it's very straightforward. It's just a standard sort of thing that you'd expect to see in C or Java for doing out.init, out.write, out.flush, out.close, standard API for outputting to a file. ActiveX also has a similar sort of component, scripting.filesystem object, so you can do the same sorts of things that way. Unfortunately for the other browsers, you have to resort to an applet. And I say this is unfortunate because a lot of the thinking behind TiddlyWiki is that a single file is just extremely easy and straightforward for users. As soon as you introduce any concept of having to carry around multiple files, it means you always have to remember to attach 10 different files to an email, or upload 10 different files, or put them in a zip file and hope that someone on the other end can unzip it and all the directories work out right, or having to have any kind of server infrastructure. So all of those things, zip files and server-side stuff, it's not rocket science, but it is actually exponentially simpler if you can actually encapsulate everything in a single file. And so that's where it is a bit of a downside, that at the moment, the other browsers do actually require 2 files. So if you go to tiddlywiki.com, do a download, you'll get a zip link, and that zip will include the applet as well as the HTML. But it still does actually work. You can still save from the other browsers for the most part. And the final technique is Java LiveConnect, very old technique for talking to native Java objects. Would actually be quite cool, but it's just a very slow process, you know, to start up every time it has to try to use one of those components. The next hack is something quite different. It's something that I came up with when I was trying to create an open social gadget to talk to TiddlyWikis. And there are all these single-page files, you know, HTML files sitting on the web. And how cool would it be if we could turn all of those into APIs that could be mashed up using JavaScript APIs, the kind of thing that Doug Crockford was trashing this morning. So this is the idea where you dynamically create a script tag and evaluate that, and then the response comes back into your third-party mashup. And here you're just dealing with a single file. You've got no server-side component. So is it possible that you could have a single HTML file that also presents itself as valid JavaScript? And the answer turns out to be yes, you can. So this is a Chameleon file. It's the kind of thing where, depending on who's looking at it, you can see it in 2 different ways. You view it from the browser, just type the TiddlyWiki URL into an address bar, and you see it as a TiddlyWiki. Taken from a third-party web app, it calls on it the same URL as a script tag, and that actually evaluates in the browser as valid JavaScript. And the URL, you can see it here, and I'll show you how it looks. It's basically, you've got an open tag, open JavaScript tag, so open HTML, open JavaScript, close HTML, and so on. I'll show you how this actually looks. From the point of view of something that treats it as HTML, it ignores all this stuff at the top, because that's commented out as HTML, and the stuff at the bottom. So it ignores all that JavaScript. Fortunately enough, all of the browsers, except for IE, actually look at the doc type, even though it appears after a comment. So it turns out you can actually get away with having a doc type further down and not falling into quirks mode. And so from browsers, they'll happily render that. JavaScript, a little bit more interesting, because the HTML tags are actually ignored. And this is just some fortunate thing. I don't know if anyone can explain why this is. But they're not only ignored, but the thing that's inside them is not ignored. So you'd think maybe if they're ignoring it because they're treating it as, oh, well, you didn't really know the difference between JavaScript and HTML, so we'll just treat it as an HTML comment. It's not that. They're actually just ignoring the open tag and the close tag. So all of that HTML gets ignored, and you end up with valid JavaScript. So it is actually possible to have a single file that is both HTML and JavaScript. The next hack is kind of trying to do the same thing with vector images. And again, you know, if you have the idea of a single file, it just makes life easier. You can mail it around to different people. So a bit of an experiment again. Turned out that you can actually do this in a very simplistic sense anyway, is to have a single file where it works out as VML. Most of that is actually just VML, but you've got an SVG tag in there that IE ignores. And likewise, if you treat it as SVG, fortunately enough, most of the browsers will ignore the rest of it. You can't do everything with it, but it's an interesting hack which might go somewhere sometime, although now that IE supports SVG, maybe not. Another interesting thing about SVG is actually taking an actual block of SVG, the actual code for it, and putting it on a page turns out to be not so simple. And this is exactly the kind of thing you need to be able to do when you're keeping everything in a single file. You don't have the luxury of putting it in a separate file and linking to it via an iframe source. So it turns out that if you want to have this as a standard HTML document rather than XHTML, where you can actually add an SVG node, you have to do something like this. You create an object and you set its data attribute to data image, SVG plus XML, and the SVG code. And that way you can actually put more than one, if you like, SVG elements on the page in real time. And this could be useful if you have an SVG editor, which TiddlyWiki, the next version, hopefully is going to have. And Jeremy Ruston's done some further research on this that you can find here. And again, all these links are actually in the slides. And he's been looking at doing unique namespacing on the SVG elements as well. So he recurses through all of the things inside it, like gradients, and gives them all a unique namespace. Otherwise, you end up with conflicts, depending on how you've added the SVG elements. The next hack is to do with iframes. And this is, I think, an area that needs a lot more research that's starting to become quite interesting. You end up with, you've got all these miniature HTML documents inside your big HTML document. So in TiddlyWiki, for instance, one of the things I did was a playground application. In this case, it's a playground for HTML5 with little bite-sized applications to do little things. And these are just, this is a complete HTML document that I'm embedding inside my bigger HTML document. And I don't want this mini HTML document to be in any way contaminated by the JavaScript or the CSS that's in this bigger application. So that's why I squared it all into a new dynamically generated iframe. So we're used to iframes being rendered as having a source, that it points somewhere else, but we don't have that luxury here. So we need to actually have a technique for creating a new iframe and pushing content into it. And that's where you get code like this that basically lets you get hold of the iframes document, and then it's a simple matter of doc.open, doc.writeline, doc.close. What's also cool about running off a file URI is you actually don't have the standard cross-domain policies applying as well. So you can actually do cross-domain XML HTTP request calls. And this leads to a whole application as a scraper, because what you can then do is you can call off to a third-party site, pull down the entire HTML, inject it into an iframe, and start parsing it using a CSS selector engine. So that's a completely different application from the playground type application, but also something that's useful and people have done at Osmosoft as well. And I wanted to point out that Prem Rose has actually done a lot of work recently on iframes. He's been doing a whole widget framework called Squidget that is actually quite cool and worth checking out. And one of the ways he does it is with CSS resets that use bang important rules and so on to basically say you've got a new div where nothing else above applies. And also it starts to get into Fuse.js territory as well, about having things that don't conflict with other things that are still on the same page. But what he's also done is a lot of work on iframe squirting too, so actually being able to do this, the idea of iframes without a source is something that hasn't been explored and has a lot of subtle things, like the fact that if you move it from one part of the DOM tree to another, it basically destroys the whole content. And it's like, why does it do that? Who knows? But it does actually fail on a lot of things. So he's trying to equalize that across all the different browsers. The next hack is script islands, also a pattern I think we'll start to see more of. It's the idea of embedding scripts that don't actually get evaluated when the page actually loads. And Google's done this as a performance optimization, putting scripts inside comments. In the case of TiddlyWiki, we're doing it for a different reason. We're doing it because we want to just keep them in a nicely contained place, whereas previously TiddlyWiki was storing everything in divs, all of that content, whether it's the user's content or CSS or JavaScript. Nowadays, or in the new version of TiddlyWiki, TiddlyWiki 5, which is a complete rewrite, it's using a different text, a different type. So as long as that type's not text/JavaScript, it's not going to be evaluated, but you still have the nicety of keeping them in the place where they belong. The next hack is embedded images. Again, we don't want to carry around all those separate images, so we want to keep them in one place. So we use data URIs. All of the images you've seen in this presentation are based on data URIs. And most of you are probably familiar with the idea of data URIs. So it's just a long string that represents the content instead of having it on a separate, in a separate URL somewhere. Problem with IE6 and 7, they don't support data URIs, and even IE8 pretty much supports them just for images. So there was a hack that came out last year that was quite cool, that's rediscovering what was around a long time ago, MHTML, and the idea of multi-part HTML documents, which we've proven to work and is also being incorporated into TiddlyWiki 5. And this is how it looks. You end up with just these different blocks of content at the start. Fortunately enough, this is the same syntax as you get in a data URI, so you do have to have the redundancy of storing it twice and having to save it to 2 different locations because the other browsers can't read this, but at least it's the same content. And when you use it in CSS, it looks something like this: MHTML, the URL, and then the segment that you've got. And you can also use data URI for other things like audio, video, and font faces that you would usually expect to see in a separate file as well. So all of those things allow you to get some extended features, but without having to carry those separate files around. And the last hack to mention is the magic hash that we've come to know and love. We see this a lot, and TiddlyWiki uses it too, basically changing the fragment ID to let you store the state and bookmark things and send them around to different people. So that's about it. Just to say what's going on in the future, TiddlyWiki 5 is putting a lot of these things together. A lot of them are already in the existing version of TiddlyWiki, but TiddlyWiki 5 is it's the first complete rewrite for the 6 years of TiddlyWiki's production. Tiddly Space is multi-user TiddlyWiki hosting, and when I say it's hosting wikis that you can sort of spin off, it's not just really wikis, because it's things like this slideshow or forums or blogs or whatever people want to build on top of TiddlyWiki. And I'd love to see what people can come up with some of these hacks that I've shown today, and I hope you found it useful. And thank you. So I don't know, probably don't have time for questions, do we? Probably got time for lunch instead. Oh, okay, go on. Yeah.
When you were doing the script island and hiding the type, how did you consume it later?
Oh yeah, well that's just a matter of, you can actually just get hold of all the script tags in the document, and then, so this is for the script island, how do you actually evaluate those scripts later on? So you just get hold of all the script tags, look at their inner HTML, and you've got access to that information.
You don't know when to get access to, say, the multi-part thing. Would you be able to get access to that?
You can get access, to actually get access to the content. I think you actually can. I'm not 100% sure, but I think...
Then you wouldn't have to do the data URI twice for images.
Yeah, that's true, except I think if you can get access, it might only be in IE that you can get access to it. But yeah, because I think the reason I say I think you can get access to it is I mentioned that originally TiddlyWiki is, or the current version of TiddlyWiki, it's storing everything in divs. The next version will store some things in script tags and other things in MHTML, so I think that's why you can actually get hold of it in IE. Yeah. Cool.